This is Hanan Mudaffar, and this is part of a series of lectures highlighting the main ideas in Belagia Goulimari's book, Literary Criticism and Theory, From Plato to Postcolonialism. This session is on Chapter 6, Freud and Psychoanalytic Criticism, the Self and Fragments. Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic theory emerged in the context of late 19th and early 20th century modernity, responding to social upheaval, war, and cultural fragmentation. Rather than treating subjectivity as stable, rational, and coherent, Freud reimagined the self as internally divided and governed by unconscious processes beyond the reach of reason. He proposed a tripartite psychic structure, the id, ego, and superego, in which the ego is caught between instinctual drives, or the id, moral demands, or the superego, and the demands of external reality. At the center of this model lies the unconscious, not merely a place of buried thoughts, but a dynamic system of exclusion, where repressed wishes persist through displacement, condensation, and symbolic return. Freud introduced the opposing forces of eros, or life drive, and thanatos, death drive, whose struggle generates repetition, compulsion, trauma, and inner conflict. Dreams, neurotic symptoms, slips of the tongue, and fantasies all provide coded expressions of these unconscious conflicts, structured not randomly, but according to symbolic logic. The idea of deferred action complicates linear time, suggesting that trauma is often reconfigured after the fact and only retroactively understood. Freud's reflection of melancholia reveal how the ego incorporates lost or ambivalent objects, internalizing conflict and producing a divided, mournful subject. For Freud, literature becomes a vital space in which these psychic tensions are symbolically staged, as seen in writers like Beckett, Lawrence, and Woolf, who explore fragmentation, repression, and desire. Jacques Lacan reinterpreted Freud through structural linguistics, arguing that the unconscious is not a hidden container, but a structure shaped by language. For Lacan, the subject is formed through misrecognition, beginning in the mirror stage, where the infant identifies with an image of wholeness that masks inner chaos. This marks entry into the imaginary order, a realm of visual identification and illusion, later disrupted by the symbolic order of language and law. In the symbolic, the subject becomes a speaking being, placed within cultural structures and defined by the signifier, which organizes desire through absence. Lacan also introduced the real, a third register representing what cannot be symbolized or integrated, the traumatic remainder that resists expression. Identity in this model is always shaped by language and thus never whole, marked by slips, gaps, and méconnaissance or misrecognition. Literature becomes a space where this divided subject plays out and where language performs rather than resolves psychic contradiction. In Lacan's view, meaning is never fixed, but endlessly deferred, sliding through signifiers without reaching closure. His theory challenges assumptions about character, authorial intention, and stable narrative voice, focusing instead on alienation and instability. With Lacan, psychoanalysis becomes a theory of lack, where language fuels desire, yet blocks full self-knowledge. Melanie Klein reshaped psychoanalytic theory by focusing on the earliest stages of psychic life, locating conflict not in the erbil stage, but in infancy itself. She introduced the paranoid schizoid and depressive positions, which describe how infants split experiences into good and bad to manage anxiety and emotional overload. Through projective identification, the infant expels intolerable feelings into the caregiver, especially the mother, who becomes both comforting and threatening. These primitive defenses and identifications lay the groundwork for later relational patterns and adult neuroses. Klein's concept of part objects, like the breast, shows how the ego forms around fragmented perceptions rather than whole integrated identities. Her emphasis on early aggression, envy, and the complexity of maternal detachment fundamentally revised Freud's model of psychic development. The infant's ongoing movement between splitting and integration echoes into adult emotional life, surfacing in literature and fantasy. Klein's work provides rich tools for understanding how characters internalize fractured relationships and how literary texts stage unresolved early anxieties. Kristeva extended the theories of Freud and Klein by exploring the concept of the abject, what must be cast out to form a stable self yet always threatens to return. In Powers of Horror, she describes abjection as a psychic boundary zone, bodily, maternal, and linguistic, where identity begins to unravel. This process involves a violent and necessary separation from the maternal body, which cannot be fully absorbed into the symbolic order. Drawn from Klein's notion of ambivalence and Freud's insight on melancholia, Kristeva in Black Sun connects depression to a failure to mourn a lost object that was never clearly differentiated from the self. She introduces the concept of the semiotic, a pre-linguistic rhythmic force tied to the maternal and the body, that disrupts the symbolic realm of structure and law. Literature, especially poetry, offers a space where this semiotic energy resurfaces, breaking syntax and destabilizing fixed identity. Kristeva argues that avant-garde and feminine writing challenges conventional narrative forms by revealing the instability beneath coherent subjectivity. Her work positions the maternal not as a peripheral figure, but as a psychic and linguistic foundation of subject formation. In this way, Kristeva redefines psychoanalysis as a theory of loss, rhythm, and revolt, extending its reach into both politics and aesthetics. Freud's theory of gender centers on the Oedipus complex, where the boy fears castration by the father and the girl experiences penis envy, resulting in different psychic outcomes. This model was challenged by Karen Horney, who dismissed penis envy as a male projection, and by Melanie Klein, who emphasized the pre-Oedipal bond with the mother. Joan Riviere added nuance by theorizing womanliness as a masquerade, a defensive performance masking anxiety and asserting social conformity. Freud himself reconsidered aspects of his gender theory, especially in female sexuality, where he acknowledged the complexity and instability of female development. In literary theory, Harold Bloom reframed Freudian ideas in his notion of an Oedipal struggle among male poets, which Gilbert and Gubar contested with their idea of the anxiety of authorship among women writers. Works like Wolf's A Room of One's Own and Orlando explore the psychic and cultural effects of exclusion from male literary lineage. These debates illustrate how psychoanalysis continues to shape feminist thought by revealing gender as a site of symbolic negotiation, psychic conflict, and creative resistance. Early psychoanalytic criticism often treated literary texts like case studies, applying Freudian theory to diagnose characters or authors. This model gave way to a more reciprocal approach led by Maud Ellmann, Jacqueline Rose, and Shoshana Felman, who saw psychoanalysis and literature as mutually interpretive. Instead of extracting meaning through theoretical control, these critics emphasized the textuality of theory and the rhetorical nature of both fields, marked by gaps and uncertainty. Felman, for example, argued that both literature and psychoanalysis are errant practices where meaning is always incomplete and open-ended. Ellmann likewise suggested that psychoanalysis listens to the text as an analyst listens to a patient, attuned to silences, excesses, and symptoms rather than clear meaning. This shift reframes psychoanalytic criticism as a dialogic engagement, not a method of mastery, with text seen as sites of repression and resistance. Reading becomes both emotional and ethical, unfolding not through certainty, but through attention to what the text withholds or cannot express. Jacques Lacan's emphasis on language as the structure of the unconscious had a profound influence on literary theory, especially through his concept of the signifier, which continually differs and disrupts meaning. In Lacan's view, the subject is never a coherent whole, but is formed through misrecognition, beginning with the mirror stage, where the child identifies with an external image that masks internal disunity. This illusory coherence is disrupted upon entering the symbolic order, where the subject is caught within a web of language and law, governed by the signifier's endless substitutions. Literary texts, under this model, are understood not as expressions of inner truth, but as fields of slippage, where characters and readers alike are alienated by language. In her reading of Poe's The Purloined Letter, Shoshana Felman applies Lacanian theory to show how knowledge and interpretation are shaped by what is displaced, delayed, or concealed. Barbara Johnson and Jacques Derrida critique Lacan's method, noting how his claim to resist interpretive mastery ironically imposes theoretical control. Their work reveals that even deconstructive and psychoanalytic readings are shaped by desires for coherence and theoretical authority. Lacanian literary criticism thus becomes a practice of confronting the impossibility of stable meaning, where interpretation is itself a performance of the unconscious. In Lacan's model, the real is what cannot be symbolized, named, or fully integrated into the imaginary or symbolic. It is the traumatic core that resists assimilation. Unlike the symbolic, which structures law through language, and the imaginary, which offers illusory unity, the real marks a site of rupture and psychic disturbance. The real often appears in breakdown, silence, or horror, moments where language and narrative collapse under pressure. Slavoj Žižek reworks Lacan's real through ideology, arguing that reality depends on symbolic fictions and the real erupts when those fictions fall apart. In literature, the real is not a visible thing, but a structural limit found in the unspeakable, the uncanny, or the traumatic return. Works like Dracula, To the Lighthouse, and Beloved dramatize this intrusion through death, madness, and ghostly figures. These moments resist narrative closure and force both characters and readers to confront what defies representation. Literary form, in this view, becomes a space of psychic fracture, not unity, where repression yields to disruption. The real recasts literature, not as expression, but as a confrontation with the limits of language and symbolic meaning. Julia Kristeva brings psychoanalysis into dialogue with avant-garde literature through her concept of the semiotic, a pre-linguistic mode linked to the maternal body, rhythm, and effect. Unlike the symbolic, which structures language, identity, and law, the semiotic introduces disruption, instability, and bodily force into discourse. It is not a separate system, but an undercurrent in language, surfacing through rhythm, intonation, and the syntactic breaks. Kristeva finds this force in writers like Mallarmé, Joyce, and Woolf, whose texts unsettle the symbolic but by breaking narrative logic and linear form. Literature becomes a space where the semiotic re-emerges, letting repressed drives and unassimilated maternal energies surface. These ruptures do not cancel meaning, but expose the cracks within structured language and identity. For Kristeva, this aesthetic process is politically and psychically charged. It challenges symbolic order and reimagines subjectivity as fluid. Feminine or experimental writing, then, enacts not control, but a revolt against closure, making literature an act of psychic resistance. In Reading for the Plot, Peter Brooks draws on Freud's theory of repetition compulsion to explain how narrative unfolds through delay, detour, and symbolic return. He argues that plot is not just a sequence of events, but a psychic structure shaped by tension, discharge, and the oscillation of desire. Using the Russian formalist distinction between fabula or story and sujet or discourse, Brooks suggests that narrative shapes latent content into patterned expression. Narrative in this model is driven not by conscious resolution, but by the compulsion to bind and defer satisfaction, an aesthetic form of psychic tension. Though critics like Harold Bloom and Gilbert and Gubar offer genealogical models of literary inheritance, Brooks shifts the focus from literary lineage to textual energy. He presents narrative as an erotic and formal mechanism that enacts rather than explains psychic repetition and interpretive desire. Psychoanalysis, for Brooks, helps us understand not who authors are, but what stories do to bind readers in a rhythm of longing, resistance, and release. In psychoanalysis, transference describes the unconscious redirection of feelings from one figure to another, most notably from the patient onto the analyst, revealing hidden desires and conflict. In literary criticism, this concept reframes reading as an encounter shaped not by detachment, but by emotional investment and psychic projection. The literary text becomes a scene of transference, where the reader unconsciously reenacts prior psychic dramas through the act of interpretation. According to Peter Brooks, narrative itself is structured by repetition and delay, pulling the reader into a rhythm of desire that mirrors the analytic process. Barbara Johnson and Lacan emphasized that reading is never neutral. It is shaped by the reader's own defenses, identifications, and desires. Interpretation, then, is not simply an intellectual decoding, but a symptomatic performance, a space where repressed meanings return through the critic's reading. In this view, psychoanalytic criticism becomes an affective practice where knowledge is partial, meaning is unstable, and the act of reading is itself a psychic event. In conclusion, psychoanalysis has fundamentally altered how we understand subjectivity, exposing the self as divided, unstable, and shaped by unconscious forces. It provides powerful tools for analyzing literature, not by decoding fixed meanings, but by exploring repression, fragmentation, and symbolic displacement. Literary texts become spaces where desire, trauma, and identity are staged, disrupted, and reimagined through form and language. Rather than offering definitive interpretations, psychoanalytic criticism foregrounds the uncertainties and affective investments involved in reading. In doing so, it transforms both literature and criticism into dynamic sites of psychic exploration and ongoing negotiation. Thank you for your attention.